Glue the flesh side of your midsole where marked. Then glue the foam cushion and then attach it when the glue dries. Then glue over the foam and all around. Glue the big sock lining too. Once the glue is dry on all sides, attach the sock liner to the midsole. Sock liners are made 3 mm smaller all around, so when you attach them to the midsole and match the edges will naturally curl up. Side note, if you want to make a shearling as a sock liner, make the sock liner smaller so it is just 3 mm or so bigger than the foam shape, just enough to cover the foam. It's ready to be hole punched. Use a mallet, a hole puncher, and a thick leather under your work so you won't mark your tabletop, and punch all the marked holes. 1 or 2 hammer knocks should punch out the hole. If it doesn't, maybe it's time to sharpen the hole punch. Go around the entire midsole piece and do the same on the other foot. Punch holes for the upper vamp and upper quarter pieces. You can punch one layer at a time or clip the material securely in multiple spots and hole punch 2 layers stacked on top of each other. Make sure the materials won't move. It'll take a little time, but take your time, and at the end it'll look something like this. Apply double stick tape at the edge of the quarter piece. It avoids where your needle will go through. Here I use multiple smaller pieces of tape, but I recommend using one long piece. To match 2 different curves, cut some curve of the quarter piece and then spread it out as you match the vamp piece. Follow the reference line and match your vamp onto the line. Now it's ready to be sewn up. I always say 3 steps to remember as you start your stitches using a high post machine. 1. Hold the threads nice and taut for the first 3 stitches. 2. Put the needle in starting position by turning the wheel on your right, always turning it towards you. 3. Put the lever in the back down to lower the presser roller foot. Roller foot is always on the majority of the body of the material and seam allowance, or the edge, to the right of the needle. Stitch really close to the edge. When you finish, turn your wheel towards you to lift the needle up, guide the threads if you need to, and pull the material towards the back or the side, and cut the thread really close to the material. Leave enough thread to grab onto for the next sewing session. Our machines have servo motors that allow us to control the speed of the machine. Some machines have knee pads to lift and lower the presser foot. In that case, I normally keep the lever at the back lowered so the knee pad engages. Now side seams are stitched. To attach your zippers, you can cut the zipper to size. I'm just going to use a longer one. Measure it out like this. I'm going to put a staple in here just so that the zipper will stop. And then I'm going to cut it off. When you're unzipping, the staple will act like a stopper so the zipper won't come undone. Then apply double stick tape to the edge of the zipper, the entire zipper. Put a shorter tape to the back side of the zipper at the top. Fold the top ends down backwards. Attach the quarter piece onto the zipper. Match the edge of the leather. Curve your material to follow the center of the zipper. Try to keep the gap tight. And put a clip at the bottom to keep the material from moving. Follow the 1, 2, 3 steps of starting to stitch. Stitch 1/4 inch or 6 mm away from the zipper to avoid the zipper teeth. At the bottom of the zipper, pivot your needle, change directions, and hand crank over the zipper if you need to. And stitch back up along the other side of the zipper. Check the back of the zipper to make sure all the stitches didn't fall off the zipper. Some people do double stitches here. Measure the top opening of the shoe. Cut a ruler-sized or 4.5 centimeters by 30 centimeters ruler rectangle for this one. It's easier to use a rotary cutter for long, straight edges. And then if you wish to make fringes, make it wider, like 6 centimeters by 30 centimeters. Skive the one long edge. If you're making fringes, cut the fringes with a rotary cutter. I like 1/4 inch width, it's like 6 mm width fringes. Cut mini slits along the front of the opening at the top of the shoe, and then double stick tape the binding piece onto the top of the shoe, shiny side to the shiny side on the outside of the shoe. So this is the French binding. So if you wish to see stitches over the binding, start attaching the rectangle to the inside of the shoe at first, and then you stitch it at the top so that you can later flip it over towards the outside of the shoe and stitch over the binding. So, and for fringes as well. You also want to attach a rectangle on the inside of the shoe so you can flip it over the top outward later. Stitch 3 to 4 millimeters from the top edge to attach the binding piece onto the upper. Once the stitch is done, turn the binding piece over and tightly fold the binding down. Place the needle right below the seam that you just flipped at, away from the zipper, and stitch right along the seam without the needle touching the binding. It's called stitch in the ditch. In the end, you won't see the stitches. They fall under the binding, or you can call it the piping, and it's called a French binding. You'll finish the threads and massage the binding and turn the shoe inside out, and then you can cut off the excess with scissors. Now your upper is ready. I use a EVA foam with diamond threads. It's an easy white layer and it's about 5 millimeters thick, so it's not too thick. And you can use 8 millimeter thicker ones too if you'd like. I trace the outsole and cut with a blade. I keep the blade straight so you won't cut the foam on an angle. Cut out the heel pieces too. I normally stack only one layer of heels for this. I sand the threads off the heel portion of the outsole. And then I apply the Renia glue, the outsole glue. And I let it dry both sides, and then I attach it. I attach it by hammering and pressing. The sides aren't uniform yet, so I use a belt sander, or you can use a handheld Dremel as well to smooth the edges. I use an anvil to put a few tacks in from the top of the sole unit out towards the heel to secure the outsole unit. Here, I'll attach the outsole to the midsole before I assemble the shoes together. I roughly sanded the midsole leather so the leather isn't too shiny. Outsole glue the sole unit and the midsole where there's a marking. A thin layer, but don't miss any spots. And let the glue dry. Once the glue is dry, you can attach the outsole. Keeping the outsole hovering above the midsole, center it both the width and the length, and then attach. Press it and hammer it in place. All ready to whip stitch and assemble. The kit comes with threads, but if you're measuring it out yourself, measure out generously 3 times the length that you're going to stitch, plus extra for good luck. 1, 2, 3 times around the sole, and then extra for good measure. You never want to run out of thread in the middle of your stitch. Use the first thread to measure out and cut another one for the other foot. For our stitching, we're going to only need 1 needle on one end of the thread. Poke the thread once with a needle, then second time away from the end. Then put the end of the thread into the eye of the needle. It makes an S shape like this. Pull on the short thread, then pull the longer end of the thread over the eye of the needle. 2 knots are formed right by the needle and the middle of this tail end of the thread. It helps to secure the thread so it won't come undone. Most sure way to know where to start would be the first inner hole at the center back, right next to the zipper. First, you put in the needle out from the top towards the bottom. Pull the thread all the way and leave maybe 5 inches or so. I now bring the upper and go into the first hole at the center back. Pause right here. I'm putting tape there so the thread doesn't move. And it's hard to position your materials at first. So you'll be stitching in through the top hole right above where you're at and out through the next hole in the direction you're going outward. So in through the top and out through the bottom next hole. Put the needle in through the top. Feel your way to the lower next hole out. Holes are pre-punched, so it should be pretty straightforward and shouldn't be hard to pull the thread. Once you stitch and tighten 4 to 5 stitches, the upper will start to sit in its place. The outside, the stitches are vertical, and then the inside, the stitches will look diagonal. In through the hole right above the stitch you came out of, and out through the next hole on the bottom. Try to tighten each stitch as you go. It's hard to adjust it later. And you'll repeat all the way to the side seam. When you get to the side seam, this is a good time to check if everything lines up and the hole count is good. 2 lines or 2 markers, it shows where the seam of the vamp and quarter overlap. And there's 1 hole between those 2 lines. Keep on doing the same whip stitch. The back half, the distance of the holes are the same, so it was very straightforward, but the front area, you almost think the upper shoe is too small for the midsole. The distance of the holes are bigger on the midsole at the front half than the upper. The upper holes are much tighter together. So this is when you'll see the typical moccasin type of puckering happening. And you want to make sure each stitch is nice and tight and evenly distribute the puckering. Again, it's hard to adjust these later, so work on each stitch and puckering as you go. And repeat. Check on the other side seam too if the 2 lines on the upper and the midsole match up. And keep going until you get to the last hole by the zipper at the back. Just at the center back, I went in through the top, out through the bottom this way, in through the top, and then I went back to the bottom to this way. So inside it looks like a crisscross stitch. I'm going to tie a knot, double knot it. Cut it rather long. Take this tape off. We're going to glue this down underneath the patch. So this is done. Center should match the center. Sides should also match. And that's the way to kind of know if you're at the right spot. To cover the tail end of the threads and the zipper excess, I use a teardrop shaped cover. If you like extra cushion, you can add more foam here, but I use just one layer of leather. Cut it, glue it, and then put glue on the shoe as well. Let it dry and apply. Use a heat gun at a higher setting and lightly heat the entire shoe where the pen marks are. Erasable pens will disappear.